Okay, hi. It is my distinct pleasure to greet you for this third and best panel of the conference, which promises not only to be a very stimulating 3 papers, but probably one of the best experiences of your lives. Don't worry about the hype, speakers. We have 3 really fascinating papers and 3 presenters that stand behind them. And I've noticed today that on top of them all being brilliant and interesting scholars, and of course good looking on all other such virtues, we all at some point have been affiliated with the Rosenzweig Minerva Center at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. So it's a nice coincidence. And okay, without further ado, I'll just invite our first speaker of the day. Dr. Jan Cune is a literature and theater scholar. He was born in Dresden, studied at Heidelberg University, Vienna University, and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he got his PhD. He conducted his postdoctoral research at the Martin Buber Society of Fellows, has been a research fellow and scholar artist at the Israeli Institute for Advanced Studies, and works currently as affiliated researcher at the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center for German Jewish Literature and Cultural History. And his talk would be titled Inventing a Zionist Consciousness, Sammy Gronemann and the Zionist Consciousness. Please, yeah. Here.
Thank you very much, Yuval, and thank you very much for the organizers of the conference and of this panel. Should I sit or stand? What do you prefer? In any case, I will serve as your guide to the subconscious, considering the time as the first speaker after lunch. Changed my subtitle slightly, as you can see. Inventing a Zionist Conscience, Sammy Gronemann and the Zionist Congress Court. The notion of an individual and self-determined human conscience is a product of European Enlightenment. Initially a Christian invention, the notion of freedom of conscience was adopted by Jewish Enlightenment thinkers and played a key role in efforts to advance Jewish emancipation throughout the 19th century. One of the first Jewish thinkers to introduce this notion was Moses Mendelssohn, who described the ambivalent nature of the freedom of conscience within a dialectical relationship between state and religion. Liegen sie, Staat und Religion, gegeneinander zu Felde, so ist das menschliche Geschlecht das Opfer ihrer Zwietracht. Vertragen sie sich, so ist es getan, um das edelste Kleinod der menschlichen Glückseligkeit. Denn sie vertragen sich selten anders, als um ein drittes moralisches Wesen, die Freiheit des Gewissens, die von ihrer Uneinigkeit einigen Vorteil zu ziehen weiß, aus ihrem Reiche zu verbannen. In other words, freedom of conscience is both dependent upon and threatened by the relationship between state and religion. It is only to the discomfort of the relation between both that a given society can realize its freedom of conscience, a dissatisfaction to be tolerated, and a point to which I shall return. Mendelssohn highlights the fragile nature of individual conscience. It easily falls prey to allegiances between state and religion, always in danger of being censored. Thus it comes as no surprise that it needs protection and became enshrined in key articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948 as a lesson learned from the calamities brought about by German fascism. Article 1 holds that, quote, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 18 specifies that, quote, everyone has the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which implicitly refers also to the freedom of language, considering the second article and the fact that it has been translated in over 500 languages. Freedom of conscience, therefore, is paradigmatic and indispensable for our post-Shoah world order. In the following, I would like to present to you points of departure for a research on this notion of freedom of conscience, particularly how it informed Theodor Herzl's vision of a Jewish state and how it consequently changed throughout the institutionalized process that led to establishment of the State of Israel. My starting point is a text formulated by the Chief Judge of the Congress Court, formulated shortly after his resignation from his post on the last Zionist Congress, 2 years before the foundation of the State of Israel. Sammy Gronemann had held this position as a voice of the, quote, institutionalized conscience of the Zionist movement, end of quote, that is to say, as Chief Judge of this Congress Court since 1921, as well as of the Zionist Court of Honor, which he had founded in the same year. These bodies, these legal bodies, eventually dissolved into the Israeli Supreme Court. However, to date, no research exists on these institutions, including, in this respect, on Gronemann, a pioneer of German Zionism, who served as one of the longest continuities and highest authorities in the Zionist movement. His voice was a decisive one, with distinguished criticism, as formulated here in the protocols of the 1946 Congress. Es fehlt das Gefühl für Disziplin, das Verständnis für das Wesen der Demokratie. Es mangelt jede Toleranz gegenüber den abweichenden Anschauungen anderer, und wir Juden sollten nach unseren Erfahrungen gewiss am wenigsten in diesen Fehler verfallen. Diese Erscheinung, dass man um eines angeblich guten Zweckes willen jegliches Mittel, Fälschung und Terror benutzt, ohne sich dessen bewusst zu werden, dass man letzten Endes nur Schaden anrichtet, ist uns auch sonst nicht unbekannt. Der Satz, der Zweck heiligt die Mittel, stammt nicht aus jüdischer Quelle. Diese Mentalität ist sicher nicht auf jüdischem Boden gewachsen. Such criticism of a Jewish Machiavellism is hardly surprising, given its presence in most political contexts. However, on the shoulders of Gronemann, the voice of the constitutional conscience of pre-state Zionism, this burden was too heavy. Shortly after his resignation, he wrote a short essay titled On My Exoneration, zu meiner Entlastung, wherein he sought to clear his own conscience. He wrote, die deutsche Sprache ist mein Lebenselement, eine Art geistige Heimat. Und diese, meine Sprache, lebt im Exil. He wrote this in Palestine. Und diese, meine Sprache, lebt in Exile. Und gerade dort, wo ich selbst eine Heimat gefunden habe, die Heimat, die lange Sehnte, für deren Erreichung ich von Jugend auf gekämpft habe. Und hier erlebe ich, wie so viele meiner Schicksalsgenossen, dass dieses mein Lebenselement verachtet, verfolgt und verpönt ist. Die alte Erfahrung der Geschichte wiederholt sich, dass die Mentalität des Besiegten letzten Endes den Geist des Siegers durchdringt. Und nach Hitlers Fall haben seine fanatisch-faschistischen Ideen überall Wurzeln geschlagen, selbst im Lande der Juden, denen er die physische und geistige Vernichtung angedroht hat. Gronemann then goes on to iterate his criticism uttered at the 1946 Congress, while expressing his hope that this phenomenon would disappear after a transitional phase. Die Freiheit des Gedankens und der Rede, die Freizügigkeit in jedem Sinne, werden, wenn irgendwo in der Welt, in Israel verwirklicht werden, wenn nicht in dieser Generation, so in einer späteren, die sich von den Schlacken des Exils frei gemacht haben wird. So, this recourse to the freedom of thought and speech, of conscience, set in bold also in the original text, is instructive in at least two respects. One, Gronemann identified therein one of the main problems of the Zionist project, not only with respect to its Hebrew language politics, about which a lot of research has been and is still being done. Second, in his essay, Gronemann loses the humor for which he was legendary among his contemporaries. His wit and humor pervades all of his writings, even his single attempt to write a morning play. Yet this last essay is devoid of his characteristic wit. My question is, why? So, in Gronemann's Theory of Jewish Humor, published in 1945, 1 year before the final Zionist Congress, the task of wit in this theory of humor was to defend optimism, understood as a specific Weltanschauung that evolved out of Jewish Messianism. However, in his essay on his exoneration, Gronemann's optimism lies bare. Stripped of the characteristic wit he usually summoned to its defense. Take, for example, his presentation of the results of the Zionist Congress Court at the Congress of 1935, the last before the Second World War. Ich weiß, dass wir manchem wehgetan haben, aber seit dem ersten Grenzschutz, dem Engel mit dem Flammenschwert, dem Paradies, bis zu unserem Kongressgericht haben sich solche Behörden nie besonderer Sympathien erfreut. Sie werden überzeugt sein, dass man in unserem Gericht unparteiisch vorgeht. Wir sind nichts als Richter und jede Parteizugehörigkeit scheidet aus. So haben wir Freunden auf allen Seiten wehgetan. Das Vertrauen zum Kongressgericht beruht auf einer allgemeinen und allseitigen Unzufriedenheit mit ihm. So Gronemann's humorous reflection on the function of the Congress Court echoes Mendelssohn's insight into the nature of the freedom of conscience. Similar to Mendelssohn, Gronemann observed that dissatisfaction was an unavoidable result out of realizing this freedom of conscience. A dissatisfaction which Gronemann manages to ironically balance in this and in numerous other examples, which I spare you for today. However, in this essay, written on his exoneration, he is at wit's end. Therefore, his optimism that freedom of conscience would manifest itself of all places in the state of Israel appears fragile and vulnerable. And in other writings too, Gronemann reflects about the nature of conscience and differentiates subvariants such as patriotic, military, or judicial consciences. These reflect his profession as lawyer and legal expert, as well as his own position as a neo-Orthodox Jew, for example, when he distinguishes between a Jewish Volksgewissen and a German or European one. All these subvariants, however, follow the same logic which Gronemann formulated in 1902, shortly after his first delegation to a Zionist Congress, quote, in Gewissensfragen, there should be a slide for this, thank you very much, Jan. In Gewissensfragen kann nie die Majorität entscheiden, ohne Kampf gibt es keinen Fortschritt. This reflection foreshadows his later function as a voice of the institutionalized Zionist conscience, which became my point of departure for a yet-to-be conducted research into the history of the concept of freedom of conscience in the Zionist movement. It became clear quickly that beginning with Herzl, the Jewish state was supposed to be an embodiment of this concept, both for the protection of Jewish conscience from persecution, as well as for ensuring individual freedom within an intercultural, multi-religious, and multilingual Jewish state. Quote, auf niemanden wird ein Gewissenszwang ausgeübt, auf alle wirken die leisen Verführungen der Kultur. That's from Herzl's diaries. Worthwhile to note that Herzl's institutionalization of the freedom of conscience preceded that of the United Nations and became one of the first achievements of the Zionist Congress, as Herzl recapitulated on the Sixth Congress in 1903. Wir haben die ersten Ansätze zu Reformen, die anderswo noch lange Träume bleiben werden. Wir haben die Gewissensfreiheit und auf nationaler Grundlage die Achtung aller religiösen und politischen Überzeugungen. Wir haben das gleiche Recht der Frau, die genossenschaftliche Vereinigung der Schwachen und noch vieles andere in unserem Programme festgelegt. So, I'm concluding. The trope of a Zionist conscience appeared for the first time on the Seventh Congress in 1905, and this is no coincidence. It was the first Congress without Herzl, who had personified his conscience. It was the first Congress without Theodor Herzl, who had personified the Zionist conscience up to that point. In later Congresses, this personification is fetishized, and few other delegates, including Gronemann, came to be considered too as personifications of a Zionist conscience. On the Seventh Congress, however, this trope only started to become apparent in its absence, in a rhetorical appeal upon the delegate's Zionist conscience, which was interrupted by a heckler who yelled, "Gibt's ja gar nicht." Henceforth, this trope gained momentum, and the Zionist Congress itself came to be seen as an expression of a Jewish collective consciousness, as an expression of a Jewish collective consciousness and conscience, destined to remind a European conscience of the Jews' hardships and need for a safe haven, a national one. In parallel, the necessity of a constitutional conscience within the Congresses became apparent, which was established in form of the Congress Court and Court of Honor, as a conscience within a conscience, as it were. Its task was, among others, to ensure the freedom of conscience, which was contested seriously for the first time after women's suffrage was decided upon in 1920. An orthodox attempt to reverse this decision remained persistent. Failing, however, to do so, and according to Yehuda Reinhardt's quote, Agudat Yisrael eventually appealed, together with other Ashkenazi ultras, to the League of Nations, claiming that the draft regulations of the Jewish community violated the freedom of conscience of its members and demanded violated the freedom of conscience of its members and demanding recognition as a separate community. End of quote. This episode exemplifies how the notion of a freedom of conscience came to mean for Orthodox and secular Zionists opposing things, a debate which rises and falls to this day relative to the understanding of the notion of conscience itself, as a science, as participating in the knowledge of the other, as you could interpret this term etymologically. So I'm looking forward to your comments and questions, and thank you for your kind attention.
So thank you, Jan, for this really very interesting talk. I know I have many questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. In my excitement by mentioning the Rosenzweig Minerva Center earlier, I forgot to mention in presenting Dr. Kühne that he also initiated and serves as editor-in-chief of the critical edition of collected writings by Sammy Gronemann. I think at least we all know by now that this is something that we should be looking forward to. Now let me present our next esteemed speaker. Dr. Michal Peles-Almagor is a postdoctoral fellow at the Keep Center for Hebrew Literature and Culture and the School for Cultural Studies at Tel Aviv University and at the Hebrew University and at the Hebrew Literature Department at the Hebrew University. She received a PhD from the University of Chicago. Her research spans the intertwining worlds of Hebrew and German literature as well as theater studies. Her dissertation was awarded the UC Malone Dissertation Completion Fellowship. She has published articles on literature and theater in different journals and is currently working on a book manuscript titled A Hebrew Parenthesis, Jewish Writings and the Paradox of German Belonging. Michal, please.
Thank you. Okay. How do I have a very bad history with microphones. How do I take this up? I
think I demonstrated this. You should be the one.
Yeah, perfect. Oh, great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for my co-panelists and to Yuval for chairing us, and to Binyamin, who kind of behind the scenes, Binyamin Poala, kind of always continues to bring us together at the Rosenzweig Center. And this is particularly meaningful for me because this was part of my project from last year at the Rosenzweig Center, so it's always lovely to kind of have a chance to engage and re-engage and to explore new questions. So my talk today is titled, I Write This Like Vakhtangov Performed Turandot, German Poetry as Critique in Leah Goldberg's epistolary novel. During the summer of 1936, Leah Goldberg's epistolary novel, מכתבים מנסיעה מדומה, Letters from an Imagined Journey, was published serially in the newspaper Davar. Despite Goldberg's esteemed status as a promising young poet, translator, and theater critic in the Hebrew Yishuv, her novel was poorly received. And I quote, "Friends at the coffee shop, Kasit, reacted with a wounding coldness," writes Goldberg to her friend Mira Shlonsky. And I continue the quote, "On the day the first few chapters were published, I was like a diligent hostess whose guests had tasted the cake she was so proud of and said absolutely nothing. I must admit, I was very upset. Not that we really imagine Goldberg in the baking a cake, but Goldberg's sense was quite accurate. Shortly after the novel's publication in a book form in 1937, critics were quick to remark upon its overuse of intertextual references and an over-attachment sentiment to the European landscape, and accused Goldberg of viewing Hebrew as an impoverished language in need of reinforcement from German and French. Ultimately, critics were at odds with the novel's implicit attachment to the galut, the diasporic sphere, and saw its multilingual practices as a threat to the monolingual endeavor of the Zionist Project. With the novel's reprint in 2007, the winds changed, and scholars embraced its broad range of references to world literary texts, highlighting its hybrid nature. But despite this shift, little attention has been given to the presence of German language in the novel, especially in its poetic form, and its appearance in a non-translated form. My talk today examines the epistolary tradition. Oh, I forget. How do I? This one? How do I? Okay. Lego. Okay. So this is so the novel was first published serially. So we can think about it a little bit like a roman feuilleton, and only later was put together in book form. So this is from its original printing. So my talk today examines the epistolary tradition in Leah Goldberg's novel מכתבים מנשיאה מדומה, and particularly the staging of German poetry in its German form within the Hebrew novel. Combining literary and theatrical studies, I suggest that this translingual technique of German within Hebrew and poetry within prose serves as a performative device I term prosaic staging, through which the experience of the immigration is negotiated at a time of nation building. Now, there is much to say about this notion, and I would love to maybe talk a little bit about that later, but today we're going to keep it shorter. But just to say in a snapshot that it has to do with, it's an expression of migration literature. It has a deterritorialization of language, if we kind of echo Deleuze and Guattari, and it's about political intervention within the national narrative. Modern Hebrew, in the context of modern Hebrew literature, modern literary historiography is frequently discussed against and in relation to the entrenched Zionist narrative. While this narrative continues to dominate the discourse, the Hebrew-German dialogue Goldberg stages pushes us to rethink the boundaries of cultural hybridity, underlying moments of untranslatability, both linguistic and cultural. To fully understand the ways Goldberg's novel draws on literary traditions and interrupts them as a mode of political commentary, I will begin today by describing Goldberg's theatrical thought and in relation to the epistolary novel. I will then show how this poetic citationality performs in the novel, focusing my discussion on one example surrounding the correspondence among Erich Kästner's poem Exemplarische Herbstnacht, a typical autumn night, and the Book of Jonah and the city space of Berlin, arguing that Goldberg forms an alliance with the German language as a means of claiming kinship to Berlin in 1934, challenging the notion of belonging embedded in the Zionist imagination of home. I will conclude then by attending briefly to the final scene of the novel and its significance within the Zionist narrative of return. So Leah Goldberg was, just briefly, I know that many of you here know of her, but just briefly, she was a leading poet, journalist, translator, children's author, university professor, the first female professor at Hebrew University, novelist, playwright, and theater critic. She was born in Königsberg, Prussia, and grew up in Kovno, or in Yiddish Kovno, Lithuania, at the time part of the Russian Empire. Between 1930 and 1933, she lived in Germany, first in Berlin and then in Bonn, where she specialized in the philology of Semitic languages, and of course, Yifat Weiss has written much about that. And as Yifat Weiss has shown, Goldberg's experiences in Germany are crucial to understanding her oscillation between center and margins, especially in light of the threatening political climate in Weimar Germany in the early 1930s. In grappling with this political instability, I propose, Goldberg turns to the genre of the novel, rather than poetry, to reflect on her colliding identities as an immigrant and multicultural belongings at a time of nation building. The novel itself consists of a prologue, signed with the letter Lamed, which may stand for Leah, and 16 letters the heroine, Ruth, writes to her beloved Emmanuel, in which she describes her journey among Western European cities. This journey, however, is complete fiction, as is the illusion of correspondence. Ruth, as Lamed quickly shares with the reader, is actually sitting in her room, no more than 100 steps from Emmanuel, the man she desires and cannot have, and writes a series of letters that she will never send. Lamed exclaims, "Before each of her letters, she will appear before my reader, while sitting in the depth of her room, in her homeland, and writing a letter from Paris or Brussels," declared Goldberg's narrator, Lamed. And then she explains, "I write this as Vakhtangov performed Turandot. The actor applies his makeup on stage before the audience, not to forget that he is an actor and not a Chinese prince." What does it mean to write a novel like Vakhtangov performed Turandot? And I'm thinking now about our former panel, to those of us who were here. So I don't have time today to go into Vakhtangov's approach in depth, but just briefly, I would like to say that Vakhtangov used theatricality as a political means to remind the audience that what they are seeing on stage is a theatrical presentation rather than a mimetic representation of reality. I also just want to add also that for Vakhtangov, he used these modes of theatricality in order to go around censorship. So throughout, because Vakhtangov performs just after, like at around 1920s, after World War I, it's Russia. It's very, he can't really express himself, his views, his opinions in communist Russia. And so he uses these layers of theatricality and of distancing the stage towards ancient China in order to kind of insert the actors going around the audience, improvising in order to kind of create this political commentary. But if someone comes to him and say, "What's going on?" he'll say, no, it's only in the theater. So it's about this tension between what's going on stage and what goes on out the theater's door, the theater hall. So thinking through this paradigm, Goldberg draws on the 18th century epistolary model, but she modifies it in three important ways. First, in the 18th century novel, the prologue served to affirm the letters presented by the author are real and authentic, like in Richardson's Pamela, for example. Goldberg, in contrast, uses the prologue to assure the reader that the letters, as well as the heroine writing them, are complete fiction, and at the same time, hints that they draw on real-life events. Second, there is no correspondence in Goldberg's novel, but rather a one-sided monologue that imagines events as well as an addressee. And third, before each letter, we receive a short third-person description of Ruth in her room, either alone or with Emmanuel. Circling back to Vakhtangov, I read these narrated descriptions as mise-en-scènes that locate the novel between the novelistic and the dramatic, and serve as the moment in which Lamed dresses Ruth in front of the reader to remind us another time that this is not real, but a fantasy. The performance of fantasy, however, is linked to the uncanny experiences of Jews in Berlin in the 1930s. So Ruth begins her journey in Berlin, where she strolls nostalgically around Bamberger Straße. Yet the warm feeling of intimacy between her feet and the familiar streets are confronted with sentiments of horror, fear, and anxiety invoked by the display of a turning swastika on an ice cream shop window. At that moment of both heimlich und unheimlich in Freudian terms, Ruth's narration becomes hesitant, and she stutters as she tries to depict what strikes her most, the darkness of the street. Or perhaps was it emptiness, reikut? In that moment of stammering, Ruth shifts to German as she is chased or haunted, radaf oti, by Erich Kästner's poem, Exemplarische Herbstnacht, a typical autumn night. Exhibiting a sense of intimacy with German language and literature, she alludes to the Book of Jonah. She then alludes to the Book of Jonah. Transitioning into German seems to be not a rational choice, but rather an inevitable, forced drive triggered by the actual and metaphorical darkness. And I wanted you to see it, the way that it's set up in the novel, as well as Hebrew and also in English translation. כשיצאתי, and I'll read it in Hebrew and then in German, so we can also hear the code switching. כשיצאתי אל רחוב טאונציאן, הדהים אותי החושך. ואולי לא היה זה חושך. אפשר ריקות הייתה זאת. בשעה זו, שלא הייתה כלל מאוחרת, רדף אותי שירו של קסנר. Nachts sind die Straßen so leer. Nur ganz mitunter markiert ein Autoverkehr. ולי חרה מאוד. אני חסתי על הקיקיון הזה שלא עמלתי בו, שאבות אבותיי לא נטעו. Why does Goldberg turn to Kästner at this moment? Published in 1932, Kästner's poems oscillates between Impressionism and Expressionism and describes bleak and ghostly streets that are not associated with a particular place. Yet, the universal melancholy of Kästner's streets in an autumn night is exactly what makes it effective for Goldberg. By recalling the poem while walking through the streets of Berlin, Goldberg attributes the poem a location. Vis-a-vis Kästner's poem, she appropriates the streets of Berlin, making them part of the Jewish experience. She demonstrates accessibility to German poetry, as well as her ability to participate in the intertextual dialogue, to cut, extract, and rewrite. Kästner's poem becomes a vessel that loses its original non-place-specific context and shifts to encapsulate a Jewish experience emphasized by the allusion to the Book of Jonah. In the Book of Jonah, God sends Jonah to the city of Nineveh, a city of sins, to convey the prophecy that God will destroy the city. Yet after hearing Jonah, the people of Nineveh repent, and God decides to spare them. Jonah is very upset by God's decision and asks him to end his life while sitting up. So he sits outside of Nineveh to see what will happen to the city. God then provides him with a plant to shade him, a kikayon. But with dawn, he sends a worm to eat through the plant. Jonah asks to die once more, and God responds. אני אקרא בעברית. ויאמר אלוהים אל יונה, היטב חרה לך על הקיקיון? ויאמר, היטב חרה לי עד מוות. ויאמר אדוני, אתה חסת על הקיקיון אשר לא עמלת בו ולא גידלתו, שבין לילה היה ובין לילה עבד. ואני לא אחוס על ננבה העיר הגדולה, אשר יש בה 12 רבו אדם, אשר לא ידם בין ימינו לשמאלו ובהמה רבה. In this passage, Ruth, in a sense, becomes parallel to Jonah, the prophet that cares for the plant he did not work for. Yet, what does the kikayon refer to in Goldberg's text? One possibility is that the kikayon symbolizes Berlin, and therefore presents the city in a twofold manner. On the one hand, it is a city of sinners, but in the other, like Nineveh, perhaps it encapsulates the potentiality of redemption. In rabbinic interpretations, the irony of Jonah's attachment to the Kikayon stems from its provisional nature. God's confrontation with Jonah relies on the opposing parallelism that while Jonah has become attached to a non-permanent home, he is amazed that God spares Nineveh, a town with stone homes, 6,000 people, and history. Berlin, according to this logic, becomes parallel to Nineveh with its stone houses, sins, and the possibility of redemption. Whereas Ruth stresses that she has a deep familiarity and sense of intimacy with the city from the time she was a 15-year-old gymnasium student, she realizes that she now has no claim over it, as the fathers of her fathers did not plant that kikayon. The entwined relationship, then, between the Bible, German poetry, and the aggravating political reality for Jews in Berlin are emphasized by another intertextual dialogue constructed around the theme of autumn between Kästner and Rainer Maria Rilke. To whom Ruth refers to as my poet. While walking around the Tiergarten, and I quote, in the elevating purified air, there was a noble loneliness, and Ruth observes the falling leaves and exclaims, וכשיצאתי מן הדמדומים הירוקים של עולם הדגים בטירגרטן, קיטרוניה של הבות המעופפות של עלי השלכת. באוויר המזוקק והרם הייתה בדידות נאצלת. נזכרתי במשורר שלי. Wer jetzt kein Haus hat, baut sich keines mehr. Wer jetzt allein ist, wird es lange bleiben, wird lesen, wachen, lange Briefe schreiben. ואתה תהיה הקורבן. Goldberg does not provide the reader with Rilke's name, but merely refers to him as my poet, המשורר שלי, marking a sense of intimacy while concealing the identity of the poet from the reader. Once again, the German poem marks a moment of untranslatability. But it is only the poem. But is it only the poem that cannot be translated, or also the theme of autumn and the sense of decline it symbolizes? Autumn, as Ziva Ben Porat has shown, constitutes an absent season in the Mediterranean climate, and thus represents another form of staging a familiar yet alienated elsewhere in the context of the heat associated with the climate of Eretz Israel. In the novel, which takes place in the month of October, autumn also becomes a metaphor that points not only to natural decline, but also to the moral decline of Europe and the dangers lurking in the shadows of the season for Jews in Germany. By quoting Kästner and Rilke, Ruth claims kinship to German culture and to Berlin, the city she once loved. In recognizing Berlin's rejection of her as a Jew, Ruth turns to German poetry while weaving it together with biblical allusions. Paired together, they transform the literary space into a stage on which Ruth can carry, and I quote, what she refers to as the entire world, namely the multiple places, languages, and cultures to which she sees herself belonging, using the framework of the epistolary novel to do so. Demonstrating the sentiment of journeying freely among cultures, Goldberg, in a sense, echoes what Hans Sassi called Goldberg echoes Hans Sassi's view of non-translation, and I quote, Sassi, when foreign words appear in a text, they make it macaronic, a patchwork, a hybrid, a graft, end of quote. The novel thus constructs a linguistic constellation that attempts to create an aesthetic language that is, in a way, both familiar and alienated. For Sassi, though, these, and I quote, hybrid languages are born of migration and contact, sometimes migration of ideas, and sometimes migration of people. And I'm coming to an end. Goldberg then uses the epistolary form to reflect on literature in a world of immigration, while highlighting the limits of hybrid identities. Citing German poetry in the Hebrew novel, she challenges traditional literary forms to reflect on the experience of Jewish immigration anti-Semitism, and the intertwined worlds of German and Hebrew culture. Goldberg's late 1930s epistolary novel then reveals the ongoing presence of German language and culture in Hebrew literature and the collision between private and national narrative. In the context of Rilke's poems, this is particularly expressed because 3 years later, the poem will appear in her translation in a different context. This collision is further demonstrated at the end of the novel, which depicts Ruth in her room planning to leave. Triggered by the desire to depart, she imagines herself, in her letter, on the shores of Marseille, about to sail away. Scholars are unanimous in reading this ending of the novel as demonstrating a homecoming to Zion. The novel, however, offers no evidence that Ruth sails away, or, for that matter, that she had ever left her room in the small town of Eastern Europe. The novel does not end in Zion, but with a letter that Ruth locates on the shores of Marseille. To understand the staging of this particular threshold, we need to circle back to Goldberg's initial statement of writing this novel like Vakhtangov's Turandot. Vakhtangov used theatricality to create a simultaneous multi-location stage that presented ancient China, Italy, and implicitly his contemporary Russia. Drawing on this technique, Goldberg in fact locates her novel at the threshold between departure and non-arrival. Set at this threshold between Europe and Palestine, Michtavim concerns itself with the very essence and trajectory of Hebrew literature as a possible form of expression, interrupting these geospatial and monolingual traditions that are at the heart of cultural Zionism. Instead, this novel uses the epistolary form to amplify its theatricality through German poetry and to reflect on national narratives and the place of German culture within it and the lived experience of the immigrant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. Let me call to take his seat. Joshua Shelly is a graduate student in the Carolina Duke Graduate Program in German Studies. He is currently completing a dissertation on the role of German language Jewish literature, especially utopian works in early Zionism. His work has been supported by fellowships from the Leah Beck Fellowship Program and the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies. He is currently a doctoral fellow at the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center at TBU. Please.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much to my co-panelists, and thank you to Yuval for being a chair, and thank you to Benjamin for bringing us together. So I'll go straight in. I just want to make sure. Okay. Great. In 1895, Theodor Herzl first set pen to paper to begin his famed Zionistische Tagebücher and detail his powerful dream of a Jewish state. Already at the outset, he admitted to not knowing what would result from his journals. He considered that they might become a memorial for later humanity, or, he mused, they would only serve for his later Ergötzen oder Sinnen. Und vielleicht zwischen diesen beiden Möglichkeiten, für die Literatur, Herzl wrote. He concluded, wird aus dem Roman keine Tat, so kann doch aus der Tat ein Roman werden. Titel, Das gelobte Land. Reading Herzl's first entry today, over a century after his death, as we sit in a city named for him, presenting at a conference in a state, the idea for which partially took shape in these diaries, it can be tempting to dismiss the literary images Herzl uses, choosing instead to focus on the political practicalities and realities reflected in the hundreds of pages of journals that follow. Yet to do so, I argue, is to miss a vital part of the Zionist project. For, as scholars such as Naama Rokem and Clemens Peck have most recently argued, Zionism was a deeply literary enterprise, necessarily informed and shaped by a self-identified German Schriftsteller, who in many ways viewed his political work as an extension of his writerly vocation. As Herzl notes quite early on, alluding to his work writing for the stage, Eigentlich bin ich noch immer der Dramatiker. Ich nehme arme, verlumpte Leute von der Straße, stecke sie in herrliche Gewänder und lasse sie von der Welt ein wunderbares, von mir ersonnenes Schauspiel aufführen. In what follows, I developed this idea of Zionism as a movement deeply indebted to literary structures, and a presentation in two parts. In the first, I dive into the idea of the Märchen, the fairy tale, as reflected in Herzl's Tagebücher. Here, I examine a small part of the diaries to demonstrate how this literary idea was part and parcel of the influence of German nationalism on the intellectual models that informed Herzl's conception of state building. In the second part, I open up the novel Alt-Neuland to discuss how the author contrasts two different forms of reading the Märchen, or the fairy tale, and the importance of correct reading for successful state building. Part 1. The German Kaiser, or Stumbling Upon a Unicorn in a Märchenwald. As the passages I have already quoted demonstrate, Herzl cast his project using the language of multiple literary genres, including the theatrical and the novelistic. And these were hardly the only ones he marshaled when describing his project. Perhaps the best known was his appeal to the Märchen, captured most pithily on Alt-Neuland's title page, Wenn ihr wollt, ist es kein Märchen. If you wish it, it is no fairy tale. Here, importantly, the quote appears to set up a dichotomy, an either-or logic, whereby desire activates the Zionist project and the novel ceases to be a Märchen. This reading seems confirmed in the novel's epilogue, which begins, Wenn ihr aber nicht wollt, so ist es und bleibt es ein Märchen, was ich euch erzählt habe. Yet Herzl also concludes the epilogue with the contention, quote, das Träumen sei immerhin auch eine Ausführung der Zeit, die wir auf der Erde verbringen. Traum ist von Tat nicht so verschieden, wie mancher glaubt. Alles Tun der Menschen war vorher Traum und wird später zum Traum. There is a slippery movement here from Märchen to Traum, a movement that suggests, just as the language found on the first page of the diaries, that here too, Herzl sees a fluidity and natural movement between the dreams set down in literary products and reality itself. An honest evaluation of Herzl's use of the word Märchen elsewhere in the diaries must acknowledge how he sometimes uses it as a byword for unrealistic fantasy, as in his planned address to the Rothschilds, where he writes, and here it is really, no Märchen, no scam. Yet elsewhere, referring to false rumors that he has been granted £2 million for the Zionist project, Herzl takes a different tact, when he writes that Märchen, jokes, and caricatures can serve as a vehicle to disseminate an idea. But while accepting these uses and meanings of the Märchen in Herzl's work, I consider them insufficient to truly understanding how deeply he connected with the fairy tale as an idea. So allow me to go deeper and suggest that we must understand Herzl's deployment of the Märchen qua literature as more than just a resort to a vehicle of convenience. For as the diaries show, the Märchen is also intimately tied up with the specifically German political influence that Herzl drew on in conceiving of the Jewish state. Before following the red thread of the Märchen directly, I would like to dwell a bit on how much the model of early German nationalism and subsequent unification informed Herzl as well as his Zionist predecessors and contemporaries, a fact that Mark Wolowitsch wonderfully details in his book German as a Jewish Problem. Consider, for instance, how Bismarck is one of the first figures, I believe he's the first non-Jewish figure, Herzl turns to for support, albeit unsuccessfully. Or consider as well Herzl's account of the Reverend William Hechler's visit to Frederick I, Grand Duke of Baden, in search of support for the Zionist movement. Herzl, per Herzl, asks the Grand Duke to consider the possibility that he might also take part in the second great state founding of the century, the first being the unification of Germany. Here, Herzl, to Herzl's apparent approval, brings the founding of a Jewish state into the same field of activity as German unification. Later, after the Duke lends his support to the project, he encourages Herzl during a period of special difficulty with an appeal to his own experiences and recounts what difficulties he and others had when unifying Germany. Herzl apparently takes these words to heart and reminds the Grand Duke of them later. It is within this context, then, that Herzl muses that the Grand Duke of Baden is, it seems, like the good old king from the Märchen. As is probably clear, I understand this as more than a simple throwaway line. I argue instead that it is said with an awareness of the Märchen and its role in the creation of German national consciousness, a tradition that dates back at least as far as the Brothers Grimm. The Grand Duke is not the only mention of a figure from a Märchen in the diaries, however. A complementary figure appears during Herzl's recounting of his meeting with the German Kaiser during the latter's Palästina-Reise. The memory of the visit, Herzl writes, ist wie bei einer fotografischen Aufnahme, bei der die Hand des Aufnehmers gezittert hätte. Das Bild wird ein wenig verschwommen sein. Ich versuchte mir später diesen Eindruck in ein Gleichnis zu fassen und fand nur dieses. Mir war, als wäre ich in den Märchenwald gekommen, wo das fabelhafte Einhorn hausen soll. Plötzlich stand ein prachtvolles Waldgeschöpf vor mir, mit einem Horn an der Stirn. Aber seine Gestalt überraschte mich weniger, als dass es lebte. Die Gestalt hatte ich mir vorher gedacht, aber nicht das Atem und Leben dieses Wesens. Und meine Überraschung wuchs, als das Einhorn mit einer sehr freundlichen Menschenstimme zu reden anfing und sagte, ich bin das fabelhafte Einhorn. In so many ways, Herzl's use of the image of a fairy tale forest anticipates Altneuland. Notice how he finds the figure itself unsurprising. I had already thought it, he writes. Instead, the breath and the life of the being, its very reality, in other words, is the surprising aspect. Moreover, the Kaiser as human being is not what warrants this treatment. It is the Kaiser as avatar and leader of a state founded within human memory. He is the living incarnation and evidence of a successful national movement, and in actualizing the goals and ideals of the national movement, the images that spring to mind are märchenhaft. In other words, as a product of the successful outcome of the German national movement, the German Kaiser doesn't cease to become fantastical. Instead, the real becomes fantastical. And you'll forgive a little bit of humor. I imagined the Kaiser thus. Someone pointed out to me that the Pickelhaube could be interpreted as the horn of the Kaiser, but perhaps that's reading too much into it. Part 2, David Litvak and the Art of Reading Properly. With this as context, I would like to now turn to two approaches to reading modeled in Altneuland. The first by Friedrich Löwenberg, who sits despairing. The first by Friedrich Löwenberg, and the second, which I'll come to briefly, by the character David Litvak. On the one hand, the novel begins with Löwenberg, who sits despairing, having consumed dailies and weeklies, the comics, and professional journals. And then afterwards gives himself over to the lonely dreams, once again dreams showing up here, that fill his head. Yet Löwenberg's reading is only temporary, and by the end of the novel's first book, when he departs for an island in the South Pacific with his new friend King's Court, having given up on society and all that it offers, readers learn, zum Lesen kann man gar nicht. Indeed, we later learn that even while living on the island they eventually reach, Friedrich consciously refrains from reading, burning the single newspaper that accidentally comes into his hands during that time. In other words, in Friedrich, we encounter a man who reads information for current reality, the weeklies and the dailies, and entertainment, die Witzblätter. In the end, his despair of the world leads to an abandonment of all reading as he disappears into non-space in the form of King Court's Island. Readers find a contrast to this in the figure of David Litvak, a young Ostjude, Eastern European Jew, who Löwenberg visits shortly before leaving Vienna in the novel's first section. Entering the apartment, Friedrich observes, Die Stube der Familie Litvak sah bei Tage noch elender aus als bei Nacht. Und doch fand er diese armen Leute in beinahe rosiger Stimmung, als er bei ihnen hineintrat. David Litvak stand vor dem Fensterbrett, auf dem ein aufgeschlagenes Buch lag. Er las darin, während er an seinem mächtigen Butterbrot kaute. This image, notably, suggests that even as David Litvak nourishes himself with bread, the pages he consumes provide their own sustenance. Indeed, the juxtaposed dreary room and a reading David Litvak suggests that books create the conditions to ameliorate the present suffering of individuals. This suggestion is made more explicit in the conversation between the two characters that follows. David, gazing at Friedrich, shares, Ich habe einmal gelesen eine Geschichte von einem Mann, der einem kranken Löwen geholfen hat. Friedrich immediately identifies the story as that of Androcles. David's mother proudly declares, hat schon viel gelesen, mein David, emphasizing that such stories, Märchen, one might say, stem from a habit of reading. Friedrich then asks David, Bist du am Ende der Löwe? Judah hatte einst einen Löwen, to which David responds, beinahe trotzig, was Judah gehabt hat, kann es wieder haben. Unser alter Gott lebt noch. David's recollection of a story he once read, together with his impulse to map his reading onto current events and a future attainable reality, models a contrasting form of literary engagement to that of Löwenberg's. It is a reading that makes connections between that which exists and the fantastical world found in books. In other words, a connection not that far removed from the fabelhaftes Einhorn in the Märchenwald discussed earlier. The story mentioned, importantly, is one recorded in Aesop. It tells of a runaway slave, Androcles, who hides in a cave where he finds a wounded lion with a thorn in its paw. He removes the thorn and rescues the lion. Years later, the lion returns the favor and rescues Androcles after he is captured and placed in the Circus Maxima. Structurally speaking, Androcles foreshadows Friedrich and David Litvak's relationship, especially following Friedrich's arrival in Palestine 20 years in the future. The metaphor is even more rich, though. David and Friedrich immediately identify the lion with the Lion of Judah, a symbol of Jewish national sovereignty. This is even more important considering David's name and its connection to the biblical monarch, a direct descendant of the line of Judah. Given David's later election to the presidency of the Neue Gesellschaft at Altneuland's conclusion, the connection is even more suggestive. At this moment in Herzl's novel, however, no new society exists in Palestine, and the crisis facing European Jewry is still acute. David's assertion that Judah can once again have that which it once did, namely a homeland, is connected with his reading. Thus, not only does his reading provide him with an opportunity to find comfort in current circumstances, it is a means by which to imagine and inhabit a future reality in the process of becoming. As I hope is clear, my argument about reading habits of Löwenberg and David Litvak is not simply an internal observation about a dynamic isolated within the plot and narrative of Altneuland. It also contains the germ of Altneuland's meta-reflection about itself as a novel, and the work's famous epigraph mentioned at the beginning of this talk, Wenn wollt, ist kein Märchen. Through a careful depiction of these two characters, Herzl communicates to his readers an illustration of this epigraph and once again indexes his belief in the power of the literary to activate the political. And yet, the literary is more than a catalyst for Herzl. For him, indeed, even as the Märchen helps the reader envision a new dream, one must never forget how successful political movements will always retain their patina of the Märchenhaft. This, then, is how I would argue we begin to appreciate how the father of modern Zionism found a unicorn in a fairy tale forest while on his way to Palestine. Thank you. Should we stay up here? Stay.
Okay. So we have some time for questions. I'm stealing 5 minutes because we started 5 minutes late, so okay. I know I have many questions of my own, but I want to give the audience the first go. So anyone wants to? There's a traveling microphone.
Jan, I would like to ask you about your methodological way of working. You're taking Gronemann from different periods of his life and trying to figure out how the historical context is impacting upon the way he is thinking and how that works in terms of your methodology.
Should we do this? Does this make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is, it's a crucial question because you might have noticed that this is a text which I was struggling with, and for a while now. And this is actually my first attempt where I felt I managed somehow to contextualize and approach this text from different angles. I'm concentrating on the notion of the freedom of conscience, and here I think the approach is a historical one, as a historical one, a Begriffsgeschichte. So as a scholar of literature and theater, this is something I'm fairly new at. So I'm indebted to Prosaic and the Begriffsgeschichten, but I'm also trying to work out a typology from a literary angle of the notions of freedom of conscience. Because once I understood that Gronemann had this central and important function within the Zionist Conquest Court, which hitherto had not been recognized in that depth, as I feel, I think the different typologies of freedom of conscience and the notion of conscience, from a legal to a metaphorical, a rhetorical, and other functions that are apparent in the Congress protocols, my methodology thus would be a chronological one. So I skipped and I showed you where I come from, because this text obviously stirred up some emotions, and it was not enough for me to locate him in Mark Wolowitsky's book and others that approach the usually story of the German Jewish immigrant to Palestine and then felt persecuted in this, as a German-speaking Jew in the same way he had felt as a Jewish German persecuted by the Nazis in the 30s in Germany. And Gronemann left Germany in 1933, so he didn't experience the worst of it. And this is one reason to explain it. So it's fairly easy to explain his comparison that he makes and see it in the historical context. It's not a comparison, say, Yeshayahu Leibowitz would do after Landau had legalized torture in order to extract confessions from war prisoners, which is, of course, undermining that freedom of conscience. So the historical context is quite clear, but I felt that there is more to it than just the bitterness of a Yekish writer that, in the context of this text, also complains a bit about the discrimination that he felt he suffered, though among the Yekish writers, he was the most successful one in Israel on the Hebrew stage. Shlomo HaMelech v'Shalmaya Sandlar is successful until today. But I felt there is more to it, and if we approach Gronemann not as a writer, but primarily as a lawyer and as a neo-Orthodox Jew, to whom writing was a secondary pursuit, continuing also Herzl's duality between literature and political work, as Josh has worked out finally. I think there is more to discover that hasn't been discovered yet. So I'm forced, because I'm dealing with Gronemann, to get out of my disciplinary and methodological boundaries in order to understand an aspect of this text and of his life that I just felt no one has dealt with before yet. So it's interdisciplinary in the end. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
More questions? Yarden, over there.
I wanted to ask Josh about Herzl and his way of thinking about literature and his tradition. So when Herzl writes, when he wrote this ein Märchen, so and I'm thinking about the translation of this sentence into Zu Agada. And Agada, it's something a bit different. It's something with also theological affinities. It has in the Hebrew tradition, it's something with other affinities than merchant and the German merchant. So I'm wondering, maybe you found this in his writings, or you have an opinion about it. What literary traditions Herzl address when he writes like merchant?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I know enough to be dangerous when it comes to Hebrew. My sense is that the project, and you could probably speak to this better than I could, but in some ways the project of trying to take Agada, and some of the project like Bialix, where you make it the Homa, the Stoff, for a national movement, is actually taking it somewhat and removing it from its theological context in a way that's precisely trying to replicate what the Märchen did in the German national context. And so in that sense, I would say you see even there the German influence. But in terms of Herzl's not invested in the Hebrew project. I think it's pretty safe to say. And so I think Herzl is very clearly influenced by Germanic romantic nationalism, a little bit by French nationalism as well, but I think he obviously interacts with some of these people who are engaged in the project of Hebrew, the reviving of Hebrew, but I think he's very skeptical of it. So I'm not sure that Herzl himself would have thoughts about Agada itself, but that's my sense, but it's not my field.
Thanks to all three of you for great papers. I have a question for Michal. I was very interested in the way that you were kind of thinking about, so you know, what's happening in Leah Goldberg's mind when she switches from Hebrew to German as she's writing. But I wanted to ask you kind of the other direction. How do you think she is imagining her reader when her reader gets to those points in the pages? What's the reader's experience? Does she anticipate that the reader can go easily from one language to the other or not? And you know, depending on which way, kind of what is she looking for from her reader in those moments?
Thanks. It's an excellent question, and I've been debating in a way. So I'm not sure that I can say what Goldberg is thinking. I mean, one assumption would be that she, you know, she's an elitist reader herself, right? So she imagines a reader who is similar to her, right? And then that can code switch very easily. At the same time, in the 1930s, Yishuv, yes, it's a multilingual environment, but not everyone speaks German necessarily. So I mean, some have been there for decades now, so for at least 2 or 3. So it is a question whether this is legible or illegible for the folks around. I think that for me, what is most striking, or I'll answer it in 2 ways. One is that, in a way, and I haven't been able to fully articulate this idea, so this is a work in progress, which you're going to hear now. In a way, I'm struck by the fact that the critics are shocked by this code switching within the narrative. What?
And it comes out at the beginning.
Yeah, when they say like that what do we do? So, but for me, it's kind of striking because if we are talking about realism or the way that the novel, needs to, if we're thinking through Gail Glukach's idea of the novel and the worldliness of the novel, in a way, it uncovers the performance of Zionism, right? Of cultural Zionism that imagines itself as a monolingual endeavor. Well, actually, in the coffee shop, in the same cassette that, that there is a wooden coldness there, and they're actually, Hebrew is the one language that isn't present, but in fact, all other languages are present. So that's one piece of this question, and the second is. I think that she wants to invite the reader into this hall of migration, meaning mimicking this journeying among languages and cultures, but also kind of leaving some space for illegibility. Because in a way it mimics the experience of the immigrant, right? It kind of shows or demonstrates what Ruth is going through. Kind of the familiar and the unfamiliar, a disorientation. I know where I am, and I know that I don't know where I am, which is part of the immigrant's experience. And importantly, it kind of intervenes in this imaginative mode of cultural Zionism. That we are all oriented towards Zion, and within the Hebrew Ishuv, and kind of corresponding with Josh's talk. I think she's imagining a literary tradition that is monolingual but cannot afford itself to be solely monolingual. So offering this alternative narrative of Hebrew literary tradition that would perhaps be like the epistolary genre, as a genre that can carry languages, cultures, and so on.
I will take advantage of this moment of confusion by the audience and interject my own and hijack. But of course, feel free to interrupt if you come up with new questions. So I want to sort of address a question to each of you. I think in all the papers, one of the main things that was interesting is that there's sort of an intervention in a tradition or a timeline which has sort of a past to which it refers and a relevant future, not only present. And I think in your case, clearly there is this deep background of discussion of freedom of conscience in the Enlightenment, and specifically your choice of Mendelssohn isn't an innocent one, in the sense that, Mendelssohn already refers to John Locke. And what is unique in conscience, so teaches us Locke, is that it is a kind of stupid thing to try to enforce upon because it's impossible. So there's an added evil when you try to enforce on somebody's conscience because it's impossible anyway. So it's kind of a super-ego injunction in that way. And Mendelssohn, of course, interferes there, but I guess I'm inviting you to elaborate on why it is, if it is something specifically in this German Jewish deep context, rather than Luther and all of the usual suspects where one goes into in thinking about freedom of conscience as an important modern moment. If you think there is something significant there, which that was my intuition that you wanted to go there. Josh, the same kind of variation on that question. You're referring to this background of the German fairy tale and nationalism, and I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit about how you distinguish between a fairy tale, say, and a national myth. Why specifically? What is unique to this genre, if we can call it, of a fairy tale, and why would that be the sort of guiding, the thing that the Zionist literature takes up from German nationalism?
So not why it takes German nationalism, but why it takes the fairy tale.
Yeah,
in particular.
what is it about this specific mode of the literature that you think is sort of? And again, you hinted that what you're after is a way to think about the relation between literature and reality is not opposed to each other, but somehow differently united. which is a thread that leads also to the question I would like to refer to you, Michal. You presented Leah Goldberg as sort of following the footsteps of Vakhtangov, very interestingly. But it struck me that there is a difference, and maybe you would disagree with me, but I think that when an author tells her readers that something is fiction, she's creating a very similar effect to the authoritative claim that it is true. I mean, it is not an alienating, sort of Brecht-like, Vakhtangov-like effect. Look, this is a presentation, making present of the means of representation, but it's actually a variation of the use of the authorial mode. Look, here, I can tell you what's fiction, what's real. So the question is, do you think this is, in this move from theater to literature, does it carry the same effect as to the sense of the effect of the real that it performs? If that question was clear enough, I don't know if it was. So that was long. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. I think. Do you remember the quote by Gronemann when he says that conscience can never be the voice of the majority?
Yes.
So I think this would be a key to giving you an answer, because I think the adoption of that term by German Jews in the Enlightenment Project in order to further the Jewish emancipation was a project of a minority that saw itself historically through its own self-perception as the carriers of an ancient tradition that had been marginalized and appropriated, saw themselves from within as the embodiment of a neglected conscience of the world. On the other hand, more on the social, political, historical side, this is a different debate that I'm not an expert in. It leads us to Samson Raphael Hirsch, Ludwig Philippson, the whole debate about the emancipation of Prussian Jews and what role the freedom of conscience plays in the civil emancipation and taking religion, reducing the Jewish tradition to a domestic experience, and a Jew at home and a German outside, and therefore this debate that conscience is an individual thing would have been something to appropriate in order to play the game, in order to show also Jews are capable of getting the same civil rights. But the point is, what happens with this position that you can easily embody a critical voice that has been marginalized and embody the conscience, the neglected, repressed critical voice, the voice of the outside, the pariah. This is a key theme in the until Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, the Ruhestörer is a key theme in the German Jewish experience, the modern one at least, to embody a voice that has been the voice of the suppressed. Until today, Max Czolek making allegiances with other minority and migrant groups. But what happens when this notion of conscience turns from a minority position into a majority position that has to tolerate other minorities within itself? What happens in this transformation? And I think one can observe this and research it in the Zionist Project.
Okay, so if I were to sum up your question is, what is unique about the fairy tale that really appeals to Herzl? So, at one level, I think Herzl uses a couple images. He uses the Märchen, he uses the dream. At different points he talks about the utopia. And basically all of these things he kind of uses, he's not a literary scholar, but he's like, each of these things has distinguishing features. He uses them kind of fluidly to indicate that this is an idea that is unrealistic and is pure fantasy. And I think it's partially a response to his critics that say this is just pure utopian thinking, which is then when he famously says, this Alt-Neuland and my whole idea, this is not a utopia. Just as he says in his planned address to the Rothschilds, kein Märchen, kein Betrug. So on the one hand, I think that it's partially a response to the response that he gets to his idea. At another level, I think that there's the deep level in which Herzl is influenced by German nationalism. And at some level, it isn't even necessary that he's read Herder or read the early writers and thinkers who advanced that project. It's in the air. And why does German nationalism have such uptake with him? It is, and I talked about this a little bit, this is literally the most successful national movement that he's seen move from an idea to actualization in his lifetime. And so, because of that, and who's he talking to? He's talking with Friedrich of the Grand Duke of Baden, who was part of the unification project. He's trying to talk to Bismarck. At one point, he says in the diary something like, well, if Bismarck will understand this great idea, and if he doesn't, then he'll cure me of my madness. Bismarck rejects the idea, and he's not cured of his madness, but that's another story. And so I think that's important. The other thing that I would say, and this goes back to the idea of imagined communities, I think that Herzl is very much has internalized this idea before it's even articulated that you have to create the nation in the minds of people. And in order to do that, one of the things that he becomes obsessed with is opening a newspaper. He's absolutely obsessed with it. He needs a newspaper. And he's a newspaper man as well. I don't think that's something that we can dismiss. But a newspaper is necessarily going to be reliant on depicting events as they are or as close to reality as you can get away with. Whereas Herzl needs to conduct a two-mode operation in the minds of people who's trying to recruit. First, I'm going to move you in space from Europe, because he's mostly thinking about European Jews exclusively, to Palestine or maybe to Argentina at the beginning, or someplace in South America, and we need to do a movement in time. Because the way that Palestine is now is not going to work for us. He's a Viennese Jew, he comes to Jerusalem, he says, we need a mop, and we need some brooms, and we need to clean up. Right? Because Herzl needs
Look at us now.
No comment. So all that to say, this is why fantasy is so important, because he needs to help readers project themselves into a future period of time in a different place. And this is something that can only take place through the mode of fantasy.
Thanks. I'll be quick. And just to say thank you. Yes, I mean, theater and literature are not the same, of course. For me, I'm trying to trace what Goldberg's sense is of writing a novel, the way that Vakhtangov performed Turandot, and I think that it's about the performance itself, and Vakhtangov was the director of Habima's Hadibuk, and he's working on both productions concurrently, and he might have been Brecht, but he died in 1923 out of an illness, so not have it. So his thinking kind of, I mean, it is what it is. And, but I do want to maybe answer it through the notion of audience. And maybe that's the shared parameter, because the novel in the prologue begins with this you. It's just this general you, a nameless you. And she's talking about the complicated relationship between her, the narrator, Lamed, and this you. And in my reading, this unspecified you is actually a direct address to her critics in Deishuv. That's the you, this non-specified you, because those are the people to whom she writes. And in that moment, like Lamed is, she's monolingual completely. She does not transition, and when she does, she explains the words. And yet, I think that in Vakhtangov's performance, so actually it begins with the audience. Like all of a sudden, imagine you're in a theater hall, and then within everyone is gathering, and all of a sudden 10 people from the audience go on stage wearing their frocks, right, with their best garderoba, and all of a sudden they start undressing. And they undress and they take upon themselves their characters. So the actors actually come from the audience and they go up on stage, and then they transform into the characters in front of the audience. So there is always this relationship between what is real and what is imagined. Are they part of it? Are they part of the show? Are they not? And here as well, right? So it's always this question. It's this blurred boundaries. Are you supposed to understand or not supposed to understand? Is the story real or is it not real? To what extent is it real? What language do we actually speak around here? And is this this mansion is it monolingual or is it actually translingual? So blurring the boundaries. Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes, I have decided with it. I don't know how to get a microphone to you. Can you? Is there?
Do I need it?
Yes, because they're recording. I learned it the hard way. So yeah, one quick question and a quick answer.
It's a very good question. Thank you for your talks. And thank you also, Michal. I was really interested in what you had to say about Leah's text. I just wondered, has anything been written about some kind of parallel between Hannah Arendt's writing on Rahel Varnhagen, which was a supposed biography, but people say biography as a biography, and this particular supposed novels by Leah, has that been touched upon? Do you know, I'm curious, were they in touch? Obviously, the Rahel Varnhagen biography was published much later, but written much earlier. Is there a chance Leah could have read it? Did they correspond?
Not to my knowledge, which makes it a very short answer. Sorry. But let's talk more.
Great answer. Great answer. Thank you.